But until society arrives at a moment where those technologies align fully with the charter of a utility to provision lowest cost, reliable power, they won't take that action. What's exciting is I think we're in that moment now.
The energy industry often pits utilities and clean energy advocates as enemies, duking it out from opposite corners of the ring. As the narrative goes, utilities drag innovation in favor of the status quo. Their lobbying, some say, has tanked the value of distributed energy resources, leaving the residential solar and storage industry in turmoil. But one company doesn't bother with that framing, even if it may be true in some cases. Instead, they're going inside utilities with the belief that there's only one realistic path to scaling DERs, being on the same team. I'm John Engel, Editor-in-Chief of Renewable Energy World and Power Grid International. And this week on Factor This, I'm joined by Sparkfund CEO Pier LaFarge, who's partnering with some of the largest utilities to deploy hundreds of DERs on their behalf. LaFarge shares how Sparkfund's approach upends consensus thinking around the energy transition, why he's bullish on investor-owned utilities, and what the upcoming presidential election means for clean energy. That's all next on Factor This from Renewable Energy World. Pier LaFarge, thanks so much for joining the Factor This podcast. It's great to see you.
John, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I've been looking forward to this one, and I occasionally will sprinkle in a guest who has no fear of what they say and will say exactly what's on their mind, because those are the most fun conversations. And I think anyone who has listened to a podcast you've been on or seen you speak at an event or whatever will know that you have no hesitation in that area. So this is my invitation to you to just go full bore energy transition, let it rip.
Let's do it. It's my favorite type of nerd party, John.
All right. And I'm excited about this because this podcast has traditionally focused on kind of the third-party developer, EPC, IPP world, and not so much the utility side. And it's branching out in a way that is now featuring some more of those perspectives. But I think what's exciting about what you're working on is you kind of cross over into both of those worlds and have some perspectives that are maybe different from the traditional developer, are different from the traditional developer or clean energy provider. So before we get into all that, share a bit about your background with the audience and what you're working on at Sparkfund.
Yeah, I started my career very much in the climate movement, working on, policy analysis during the climate bill, Waxman-Markey. My first job out of college was with ICF International. I was a carbon accounting and kind of what would now be called, I guess, sustainability consulting for corporates, for munis. And, while I was there, realized that these big corporates just didn't know how to implement their sustainability plans, right? They would get these reports and they'd say, thanks for this information, and I'm going to go back to my day job. And so we launched an offering at ICF that was helping big organizations, work through talking to lighting vendors, HVAC vendors, and early solar conversations, prioritize projects. And in 2013, I realized that what you needed was more than a consulting offering. You needed to build an engine to actually make it easy for customers to prioritize building energy retrofits, energy efficiency, renewable energy. And so I quit my job and started Sparkfund. And really, we've been asking that same question the whole time, more than 10 years now. How do you really make efficient and resilient buildings a core part of how our society works? And that's really been the journey. So Sparkfund today is all about helping large energy incumbents, utilities, and also property owners accelerate distributed energy resources. That's our mission, to make buildings a productive extension of the grid. So we really focus on the idea that building owners and folks who have core businesses are really in a lot of ways right to focus on that core business. Energy considerations are a small piece of what they do every day. And ultimately, our job on behalf of utilities is to make that so easy that it really just happens as a normal course.
So I think the branching off from ICF and going the kind of corporate sustainability route makes a lot of sense. When did the business opportunity present itself for you to go directly to utilities and say, here's what we're trying to do to serve what should be this broader mission of decarbonization? Let us take this off your hands. Or how do we be an accelerant for what you're already trying to do? Because it's clearly not your core business or even expertise. Like, how did that all come to you?
Well, I think that something that's always made Sparkfund different is a belief that the energy transition is going to be about infrastructure and how we choose to provision that infrastructure to the built environment, and less about customer choice and adoption. We really think that, to tackle something at the scale of climate change, you need to reimagine how our society produces, distributes, and ultimately uses energy to begin with. And I think when you take that infrastructure mindset, it leads you pretty quickly to the idea that utilities have, a foundational role of providing this enormous machine, a landscape scale grid that actually determines everything about that question at the end of the day.
So what really interests me is you got started, you said 2013. So that was like right in at the peak of the narrative that there's going to be this utility death spiral and that distributed energy resources are going to lead to the demise of these giant corporations that rule our energy and power consumption and all that kind of stuff. And simultaneously, we got into another narrative of, utilities are doing everything they can to drag their feet, slow the energy transition, maintain the status quo because that's better for their bottom line. It's easier, less things can break. And I think that you're kind of flipping that on its head. At least that's what it seems like from the outside, saying that, these entities have such great force in the market to do some really impactful things, and that we need to work with them instead of, throwing rocks at them. Is that like a fair reaction?
It is fair. And look, I think there are two pieces of that. Just to talk about what utilities even are. I mean, this is a system that we invented more than 100 years ago to provide low-cost, reliable power as a precondition for economic growth. And what that means is, they've been showing up day in and day out with this incredibly complex task and keeping the lights on pretty much 100% of the time. And really, when you think of the entire economy, it's only for a couple percentage points of all the money, right? And the entire economy is downstream of electric power and other energy sources. So we always had that perspective of, gosh, that's actually a better performance than most people are saying for utilities. And when you think about them as slow to change, they're also a chartered monopoly where we said, as a society, you can have a monopoly, but you have to provide low cost, reliable power 100% of the time. And that's all you can do. Low cost, reliable, and do that as safe
to everyone.
To everyone in any building, no matter if it's profitable, no matter what, you have an obligation to serve. We did rural electrification in the 30s. It's one of the most dramatic things we've ever done as a society. So every building in the United States is going to have a wire that goes to it and you can turn a light on. And, I think kind of two things happened, right? One, they did that, and they did it so well that we started to take them for granted. They faded into the background as what we asked them to be, a precondition for economic growth and prosperity. And then the other really interesting, I think, piece of that is that when you build a chartered monopoly, you never want to give it the power to change its own charter, right? More kind of formally normative power. That's what we have, legislatures and governors and Congress. Like, we have a thing for that, right, in our democracy. And utilities have been providing low cost, reliable power for 100 years. And all of a sudden, in this moment of climate and renewable energy, distributed energy, we're asking them to adopt and deploy technologies that for a long time were simply not lower cost or more reliable. And so until we changed that charter, they didn't react. And I actually don't see that as much of a problem. I mean, I think it's really dangerous if you have a monopoly that can say, oh, great, that's a good idea. Let me use my monopoly power to just reach in to go deploy a whole bunch of new assets, right? Until society hits a moment. By the way, a moment I think we're in now. And we'll get into that. But until society arrives at a moment where those technologies align fully with the charter of a utility to provision lowest cost, reliable power, they won't take that action. And again, what's exciting is I think we're in that moment now for reasons I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah. So break down exactly what you do with a utility. So when you go up to an IOU and say, here's what we can do for you and here's how it works, like how's that structured?
The model that we're most excited about, and I think really defines the next bunch of years of utility history, is what we think of as a distributed capacity procurement. So let me just step back for a moment. We're at a moment where the grid's going to double or triple, We don't know exactly how much, but there's more power demand and more growth for the demand for electric power than there has been since the post-war industrial boom. And I've said this in a bunch of places, but doubling the US electric grid is like the technical complexity of the space race with the economic scale of the US highway system. That is just a huge societal task. And in that moment, it's a really good fit for the sort of infrastructure model of an electric utility to step up and say, we're going to plan where the assets go. We're going to capitalize them for the benefit of society, and we're going to meet that moment. So in that world, if the grid's going to double, and if they're going to need an infrastructure model to really meet that moment, that's where utilities can become a really powerful force for driving both the doubling of the grid, but also the energy transition forward. And critically, the reasons the grid are going to double, right, are now not long-term sustainability or other trends. They are just huge political inputs like new manufacturing coming back to the United States and data centers and generative AI driving a huge demand for power and intelligence, and to a lesser extent, electric vehicles. So I think that the reasons the grid are going to double really are what are going to drive utilities to step into this moment in a new way.
So then what do you do? Like, yeah. what's your role?
So in that world, Sparkfund becomes an extension of a utilities brand to do a couple of key things, right? We help utilities figure out how much distributed energy they need in their territory to grow the grid most efficiently. And that's most efficiently both in terms of cost, speed, time to power, deployment. And then we help them with customer engagement, going and talking to their customers, not selling things to their customers, but under that new distributed capacity procurement model. Let's say they want 500 megawatts of solar and storage in their territory. We can go out and actually talk to customers in a new way about extending the value of the grid into their building, having a building host a utility asset for the benefit of the grid and for the benefit of the customer, because the grid itself will become more reliable, fewer outages, shorter outage duration. So customer engagement is really the first service that Sparkfund provides to large utilities. And then the second is value chain management. To do this, utilities have to set up local competitive ecosystems of distributed energy companies, right? Folks who install solar, folks who install batteries and sell that equipment. So Sparkfund becomes an organizing layer to help utilities manage a local competitive value chain to go out and actually install those pieces of equipment. And what's great about that is that makes utilities a huge wholesale customer to the distributed energy resource industry writ large.
And is that a split between resi and commercial? Is it primarily commercial customers that you're reaching out to?
It's both. So we did a large utility program in Southern California where we deployed 1,200 homes doing backup power and distributed resources to help keep the lights on in wildfire events. And then dozens of community organizations, think libraries and fire stations and gas stations, right? Places that could stay powered and cool during those events. And we have programs with Georgia Power and a whole bunch of other, Excel Energy, where we're mostly focused on commercial and industrial buildings, putting bigger systems that are really benefiting both the customer and the grid.
So it's a resiliency play, but it's also like a non-wire alternative and like micro NWAs everywhere. And so then how does the utility will plan out where they want those systems to exist, right? And they will work with you then to engage the customers within that node or region or whatever to deploy those assets. What happens with the customer specifically? Like, do they lease you rooftop, or do they get a bill credit? Like, how does that exchange work?
Yeah, every customer and every utility is going to do this a little bit differently, right, in each territory. So I think they'll see some models under this kind of emerging capacity procurement model where utilities offer a lease payment for the customer who's hosting the assets. Hey, we'll give you a couple percentage points of that asset value, and just having a solar and battery installation on your building. I think there are other places where just the indirect benefit. I mean, customers I think recognize that the utility is providing the grid. And so if the grid can all of a sudden be present on their building, and that makes the grid more reliable in general for them and their neighbors, I think that's a model that can work too. So I think you'll see different versions of that, but at its core, this is a utility having the opportunity to engage a customer to host an asset at their location, not sell them something, and also not go out and try to aggregate capacity of customer-owned assets, right? This is utility planned, utility capitalized. They know exactly where it should go in that centrally planned advantage.
And then they can use, if they have an existing DERMS platform, they can manage those assets strategically however they want, instead of having to, hope that in the aggregate, those assets will show up for them.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So why go this route? It seems like a lot more work. Having all of, say you have 1,000 non-wire alternatives scattered throughout your territory. I see the value of the capacity. I see the resiliency play, but you have to engage with a firm like Sparkfund to go out and educate those customers, to find the sites, to then deploy the assets, and then you're managing them also, as opposed to, deploying a 50 megawatt hour battery somewhere on your grid that's on utility owned property and just skip the hassle. Like what's the greatest value point in this equation that you think kind of sells it to utilities?
Sure. So again, stepping back into this question of needing to double the grid, not all of that task is going to be delivered through non-wires alternatives and distributed assets. A big chunk of doubling the grid, let's call that 100% increase, 70% of that is going to be the traditional utility playbook. Centralized generation, hopefully large scale and grid scale renewables, transmission connected batteries, and transmission and distribution upgrades. So a big chunk of the moment that we're in is going to be delivered by replicating the traditional utility model, but hopefully in a way that has more renewables as a total percentage, right? I think that's going to require a lot of different solutions stacked to get the amount of power we're going to need, which is just, I think, going to be the focus. However, 30 or 40% of doubling the grid, right? 30 or 40% of that 100% increase is going to be distributed. And it's, simply put, going to be putting solar and batteries everywhere. And utilities are good at the centralized playbook. They're not particularly good at talking to thousands of customers and dealing with hundreds of value chain participants in a seamless and efficient way. So Sparkfund is a specialist that works on behalf of a utility to allow them to pick up that tool of distributed capacity procurement and meet 30% of that historic challenge faster and cheaper.
It also allows them to kind of like co-opt the movement and say like, no, this is our play. Like we're the ones who are trying to, make the grid more distributed and want to expedite decarbonization and give this resiliency, tool to our customers, as opposed to fighting that third party entity who's trying to chip away at their customer base.
Well, John, I think it's always been their play. And, there are very few renewable energy or solar installations that are put on houses that don't need the grid at night or when it's cloudy, right? So the grid has been there the whole time. And, I think the other thing I'd say is that when utilities think about this moment, they've been testing and learning through VPPs and aggregators and third-party programs whether or not distributed energy resources can have real sustained value to their grid. And good news, right? Like what the solar industry and what the DER industry has been advocating for a bunch of years now is true. The DERs do have real value to the grid. And in fact, for a big chunk of growing the grid to meet this historic moment of advanced manufacturing and data centers and EVs, it is lowest cost, most reliable to put renewable distributed resources into the grid on buildings. That's actually a point of increasing agreement between a historically antagonistic renewable energy and distributed energy industry and utilities. So guess what? Utilities have had that charter of lowest cost, reliable energy. So if that's true, they're going to put solar and batteries everywhere. In some ways, it's that simple. They're just going to do their job, now that that's true, and now that the grid needs to double.
Take me into the first conversation you had when launching this concept, or at least more specifically the vertical of targeting utilities and saying we'll take this on for you. Was that met with like intrigue, or was there some apprehension at first of like, why do we need you, and who are you, and what are you trying to do? How'd that go?
Absolutely. We've been working with the utility industry, kind of as our core focus since late 2015, 2016, really ramping up after that. But no question. I mean, when we first started talking to utilities about this, they had no idea why this would need to be a part of their world. Their grid wasn't growing. They had DSM programs. They were doing efficiency to the extent mandated by regulators. And when you said, hey, do you want to help? Do you want to pay us to be an extension of your brand to put solar batteries and efficiency everywhere? They were like, no.
It sounds hard.
And we're like, and it costs money. And they're like, even more? No. But look, what was interesting is that, call it 2017, 2018, there were a couple of utilities, Southern Company in particular, who actually were starting to get really curious about how their brand and how their relationships with customers, some of whom they'd been serving for decades, could be expanded to the benefit of the customer and to the benefit of the grid. And, that curiosity, I think, in 2017 was kind of hypothetical, right? They wanted to learn, they wanted to understand what it would take to engage customers. And some of the most innovative utilities in the country, and ironically, some of the largest, hired us to be an extension of their brand, to go talk to their customers and learn. And we've been spending all of these years learning what it takes to actually extend a utility brand into the building. And look, it's hard. When you have to sell a product to a customer like that, a lot of customers just choose to focus on their core business. They wake up on a Tuesday morning and they're thinking about everything from taking their kids to school to hitting their numbers that quarter, or building hotels, or whatever they do, right? I mean, that's their core business. And the best thing about a utility is you never have to think about the power being on. And the worst thing about a utility is that no one's thought about the power being on for 100 years. That's changing, but it's taken a lot of years to learn how to do that right.
Was Southern the first customer that you guys secured?
They were, yeah. Southern Company and Georgia Power and Southern National Accounts were, in our view, we talked to, again, dozens of utilities all across the country, and they were the ones who went first saying, we're curious about how distributed energy resources and our customer relationships can be transformed in this way.
Which is wild, because I don't think that would be anyone's first guess, especially 7-8 years ago, that Southern Company in the wild Southeast, non-RTO region, not a progressive state or territory for that matter. When you think about innovators and adopters of distributed energy resources from the utility side, I think you think of like Con Ed, and you think of Southern California Edison, and even PG&E to an extent, San Diego Gas and Electric, like the California utilities, the Northeast New England area. I would not have jumped to Southern, but I want you to dive into that a little bit more. But I've brought it up a number of times on this podcast that a lot of these utilities that have traditionally been lambasted for, slowing the energy transition and not innovating, like the Southeast, the vertically integrated IOUs, Southern, Dominion. Those are the utilities that are building some pretty incredible projects. Vogtle in Georgia with the first new nuclear plant we've had in decades. Dominion's trying to build the largest offshore wind project in the U.S. Just bought another asset from, I think it was Avangrid, off the coast of North Carolina. And I see these vertically integrated IOUs as like a very unique vehicle to achieve a lot of the big goals that we have. And I think it just kind of really flips the whole story around that we have in relation to some of these utilities.
I think that's a really powerful way to put that, John. And I agree with everything you just said. I think that flipping energy transition history on its head is what we're about to see. I think you're going to look back and say, for the last 20 years, 30 years, when the grid wasn't growing and when climate and energy were becoming critical questions, we went through a valuable and important cycle of policy innovation in the regions you mentioned, California, New York, New Jersey, right? Broadly the Northeast. And that policy innovation was an attempt to take a grid that was not growing and encourage it, and in some cases force it, to adopt more energy efficiency and, to a lesser extent, distributed energy. And that's fine, right? That helped drop the cost curve of some of these technologies. It, in some cases, created a lot of cost for customers, right? It created energy poverty. There was a cost, right? I think one of the biggest mistakes over the last 20 years was ignoring cost shifting of solar and some of these projects, right? We stood up in commissions for years and said, don't worry about it. Retail is retail. And we were ignoring the transmission and distribution fixed cost resources that when a wealthy customer put solar on their house and withdrew from paying for electrons, that cost of the divided transmission and distribution crushed down on the poorest and most vulnerable residents. So there was some damage that was done in those 20 and 30 years. But at the same time, some real good was done because we put renewable energy, both as an industry and a technology, on the map, and we picked up the tool that we're going to use to ultimately combat climate change. And history, when you look back at it, I think is often a mix of those trades of damage and progress. And now that renewable energy is, in most cases, the lowest marginal cost technology, now that transmission and distribution have to handle a grid that's going to push twice as many electrons to customers, small renewable distributed resources that you can build fast, permit easily, and provide real distributed resilient benefit to customers, we're going to pick that up. And it's exactly the utilities that were sitting there waiting to be fast followers that are going to drive it to gigawatt scale. And it's a mix. It's amusing, it's ironic, but a lot of times that's how history works when you put it in that context.
So who is your ideal customer on the utility side then? Is it that vertically integrated IOU that goes through the IRP process, or do you still go after these RTO ISO regions that are structured differently?
No, definitely both, because all utilities at some level are doing the sort of planning to meet customer demand, and whether that's transmission and distribution capital planning only. In many cases, those utilities are going to deploy gigawatts of batteries to avoid distribution feeder level upgrades, to lower the overload risk of transformers, to avoid substation investments, or at a distribution level, right, to have battery resources in a city so that when the wind is on, in the prairie, and it comes in at night when no one's using power, you can almost think of batteries as an energy sink, a sponge. And either you need to have a perfect smart grid in a metro area, which is really hard and expensive to build, or you need a bunch of batteries. So even utilities that don't have vertically integrated kind of IOU planning capabilities, I think are going to engage seriously with grid scale deployments of distributed customer-sided resources. However, IOUs all of a sudden have this very clear advantage of being able to assess and experience the full marginal cost of transmission, distribution, and generation. And if you put all three of those together, that entity is more capable of enacting a doubling of the grid at lowest marginal cost to society and to customers. That's not a kind of like a comment of IOUs versus, right? That's just how infrastructure works. It would be like giving a government, 2/3 of a road, but then having a paving company be completely competitive and fighting over who gets to pave the road that the government planned.
So in a dereg market, like in ISO New England, for example, then you're marketing this strictly as a T&D asset, right?
That's right.
Okay. And then with Southern Company, you can say you get the full stack of benefits.
That's right. And, I think Sparkfund's role is to go to a utility and say, what we represent, all the learning that Sparkfund has done over the last decade has prepared us to be the deployment vehicle that utilities use to get gigawatts of batteries, solar, and other building technology out into their grid, right? Customer engagement, value chain management, data and analytics, and financing. And so in that context, we actually don't have a preference of whether or not they look at it as a distribution asset, transmission adjusted, or generation. We want the utility to use its core competency of central planning, of grid analysis, and ultimately tell us how many of these things they need, where they need them on the grid for the highest benefit, and then our job is to go get it done in their territories.
Okay, so our audience loves case studies. They tell us that all the time. So what happened after you signed Southern as that first customer in the 6-7 years that came after?
Yeah, we've been working inside the Southern system across Georgia Power with customer solutions, doing hundreds of locations and more than hundreds of millions of dollars of work in their territory. Right, their customers have shown that utility relationship actually matters, that they would prefer to buy from an incumbent. They've had a lot of small companies knocking on their door saying, hey, can I install things in your building? Can I give you a dashboard that shows you your energy? And again, a lot of customers are focused on their core business. And I think what we've proven with Southern Company and our programs with them really is that utilities have the opportunity to show up in their customers' world in this way and extend that basic infrastructure role into the building and into this energy transition category. Because look, if customers don't have to deal with it or think about it, they don't want to. They want to focus on their core business and let utilities take care of the rest.
And we've seen like the resi and really even the distributed solar and storage market has really struggled over the last 18 months with the macroeconomic trends and high interest rates, all that kind of stuff. And you see some of these firms going belly up, it seems like every day. How do you square this with kind of that value proposition, the third party resi and commercial solar storage, EV charging? Like, does this give legs to that mission without maybe taking on so much of the risk and customer acquisition costs? And I'm curious, like, what you think of that market in general.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I'm of two minds on it. The companies that worked hard in that space, including Sparkfund for years, were really facing an uphill battle of customer awareness, customer engagement, and just customers caring at all, right? I mean, when you show up to a customer, whether it's a residential customer or a big company, at some level, you're asking them to stop what they're doing. Again, I always call it, this is like the Tuesday test, right? Do people wake up on a Tuesday and say, today's the day I'm going to make my lights 70% more efficient, or I'm going to put a little version of the grid on my house and have people up on my roof? And, there, in every part of the country, there is some percentage of people and companies who will do that. And I think that our industry did a darn good job of finding those customers, engaging them, building competitive, well-engineered proposals, and building a business, building an industry, right? We also would, I think, deserve credit as an industry for lowering the cost curve and proving that early adopter phase. But it doesn't take very long to run out of the 5 or 10% of people in a given place that actually care enough to talk to you. And I think the biggest challenge of the solar industry, just to use them as an example, but even third-party aggregators for VPPs, when you run out of people who you haven't talked to already, your customer acquisition cost goes up as you scale, not down. Most businesses, as they scale, see their customer acquisition fall because they become a regular product that people are used to consuming and are aware of. People are aware of solar. They're aware of smart thermostats. They're aware of energy efficiency, and they are actually starting to consume less of it less quickly as you run out of those early adopters. That is a perfect proof point that the challenge of the energy transition is first and foremost a challenge of provisioning infrastructure to society, and that our society and customers who live in it have a preference to not have to worry about this stuff if someone will do it for them. And the utility exists to do it for them.
You talked about really briefly cost shift, which can rile up a lot of people and has been a utility talking point for a long time and was kind of the crux of the NEM 3.0 battle in California.
Right.
You do believe that there is a cost shift that takes place with those early adopters and those that go kind of the third party route to go solar and storage. Why do you think that's been such a point of consternation within the industry, and why do you think it's important to like identify that that's something that we've contributed to?
That's a great question, and it is a difficult one because the whole debate about cost shifting balances the very real and very important task of bringing renewable energy online to fight climate change, which ultimately is a cost that hurts everyone, and first the most vulnerable, right? So my career in climate change is motivated by the idea that climate is ultimately a human risk and a moral risk. I think nature is going to be fine, by the way. There's been a lot of climate change over billions of years. But when you start to change the climate faster, it makes it hard for us to run complex, fragile, and prosperous economies. So climate change matters. And when you don't solve it, vulnerable people suffer. So I deeply feel that foundational argument about why putting renewable energy into the world matters and why it is ultimately an issue that relates to that concept of vulnerability. However, infrastructure, the way we've set up utilities, always is this question of how much does it cost to deliver low cost, reliable power divided by the number of people who pay for that power. And you have variable costs of generation and you have fixed costs of transmission and distribution. And what solar is at the end of the day is asking often the wealthiest customers who procure the most energy, the biggest houses, the biggest businesses, to start producing their own energy on their location. And when they stop paying for an electron, and if they're given a retail price, the full normal price of that electron, well, that price was built up out of transmission, distribution, and generation. So if you're avoiding retail price and not using those resources, those fixed costs get divided on everyone else who stays in that grid. And so if you run that experiment for 10 or 20 years and a bunch of the wealthiest people in a state, say California, start producing their own energy and getting the full credit of the retail price of power, well, the cost that remains of the transmission and distribution gets divided between poorer and poorer people who still have to pay for the grid.
So we're nearing the end of this conversation. We only have a few minutes left. You're in Washington, D.C. right now. You are my first interview since President Biden announced he would not be running for re-election, given that happened yesterday, early afternoon. Right. So the curveball to you will be, what the hell comes next, and how are you thinking about whatever the next 4 years will look like, whether that's a return of President Trump, whether that is Kamala Harris or whoever. I talk a lot over the last year with guests on this show about this concept of like Trump proofing the business, and everyone kind of on the third party clean energy side is thinking about this in one way or the other, whether they think it's, a real concern or just more industry gossip. But I'm curious, like, where you land, because I feel like you're a little Trump proof in a way, because your ideal customer is the utility, and utilities kind of just keep marching on, and they'll continue to get their return on equity, and your value proposition likely isn't going to change much, at least in the interim. So, like, where do you land on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, it's been a historic week for the country, and a lot of layers of that conversation, of course.
I love also giving you no prep to answer that question, which is just kind of like how I roll.
Like every American, John, I've come out of the weekend thinking about what this means for our country, what it means for my business, and what it means for the grid and for climate. And I'll say two things. We are in a historic realignment in American politics. Tectonic plates are shifting. Sean Bryan, the head of the Teamsters Union, spoke at the RNC last week. Both parties, both the Democrats and Republicans, have serious and nuanced industrial policy. They've come together several times over the last couple of years on the CHIPS Act, on the infrastructure bill, right? The IRA wasn't bipartisan, but it reflects in a lot of ways some of the same questions of industrial policy that run through the economic policies of the Trump administration. And what's so interesting is it was actually Republicans in that shift towards Trump that opened the opportunity for an industrial policy, for trade policy, for serious engagement of what technologies do we make here at home? What do we consume abroad? How are the answers to those questions related to our geopolitical outcomes?
Yeah, like the America First kind of concept didn't go away when President Biden took office.
No. I mean, look, this is there's a lot to disagree on, and there's a lot that those sides frame differently. And look, there are real choices. But one of the things that surprises me most about the moment we're in is that both parties have a sustained and serious engagement with industrial policy and now labor policy. And I think that when you zoom out into a climate context and an energy transition context, the two things that matter most are that manufacturing is coming back at unprecedented scale, something like $600 billion of new announced manufacturing facilities in these United States, and that generative AI and data centers are going to transform how much power we need to power our economy and grow our economy from a productivity basis. And if both of those things are true, those are durable, hard signal political economy trends, and the grid is going to double to meet that moment. And it turns out that right now, putting solar and batteries on a whole bunch of buildings is a critical tool for our society to pick up, to double the grid faster, cheaper, more reliably, and to bring a lot of new value to customers. So I don't see that as a political question. I see it as an infrastructure question. I think that's a hopeful thing for our economy and for the climate.
Well, it seems like one of the main concerns is the threat of unraveling the Inflation Reduction Act. And I would assume that a big piece of your value proposition to utilities is like, go tap into these federal tax credits if you can. And maybe it's not, but like, how much do you think about that in the context of what you're pitching to utilities?
Yeah, look, I think that the IRA is good policy that was pretty well designed. And it made renewable energy and battery systems incrementally cheaper. But at the same time, it made them more expensive because, again, I think in a positive way, it had a lot of labor policy in that bill, requiring union participation and prevailing wage. And again, I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, the IRA is most related to whether customers will decide on that Tuesday to pay for renewable energy or battery systems. It is a cost adjustment of renewable energy when you're comparing it to the experienced price of power or the value of resilience or all the value streams underneath customers' decisions to procure distributed energy. What I'm talking about, John, with this utility-led DER deployment concept is comparing solar and batteries to substations, transmission lines, and not just on a cost basis, but on a time to power. How fast can you build 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 solar and battery installations on rooftops all across the territory versus taking 20 years to permit a new transmission line into a metro area, right?
It was a ricochet at SunZia.
Right. And look, there are questions about how fast we can build centralized resources, how quickly we can permit them. You have NIMBYism, and then you have the enormous cost of rebuilding and restructuring parts of the grid to meet this moment. So I think that even if the IRA went away, and look, I hope it doesn't, and I don't really expect it to, because of the political geography of where those factories are getting built, and frankly, the fact that I think it, despite the political rhetoric, aligns pretty well with both sides' industrial policy. I think it's a reflection of that shift that's more alignment than disagreement. And, when you compare a gigawatt of solar and storage to tens of billions of dollars of transmission upgrades and distribution, it looks pretty cheap. It's the lowest cost way to grow the grid. And so I think that even in the unlikely scenario that the IRA goes away, this will become even more the center of where the DER deployment in the United States finds its growth.
Yeah, look at Eversource. They just got approval to build a $2 billion underground substation in Cambridge. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. So the money is there. And did you see that project? I think it's only the second underground substation in the United States. Anaheim did it 15 years ago for some reason. I'm not sure why. But these are gargantuan infrastructure projects. Right. And I was curious when even reading through that, how many non-wires alternatives can you pay for with $2 billion? I feel like a lot.
Oh, look everywhere around the country, right? Bringing renewable energy from the Dakotas into Denver, bringing new solar resources or gas resources from rural Georgia into Atlanta. When you're talking about redesigning a transmission and distribution system that was built in the 50s and 60s in a modern city where there is very little land, everything is expensive. Permitting, NIMBYism, politics, neighborhoods. I mean, this is not just an economic question. It's not like some abstract, well, just how much does transmission into Metro Denver cost? I don't know. There's no answer to that question. No one knows the answer to that question, if you can even pay for it at all with infinite money. City council meetings are in your way.
Yeah.
And in that environment, right, putting just a grid scale relief of generation and storage in those dense, congested metro areas to supply electrons, to supply reliability, to create backup power, feels increasingly like a no-brainer. And it changes. Look, if what I just said is true, it changes everything we know about the energy transition, everything we've been talking about for this first chapter. And I've said this before. I think that what we're talking about here in this conversation, John, is chapter 1 of the energy transition ending. And we're talking about the early signals of chapter 2. Chapter 1 was about decarbonization and ESG and customer preference, and in some cases, cost savings to the individual customers who could afford to buy solar. Chapter 2 is about infrastructure. It's about manufacturing, data centers, EVs, and grid history, where we're going to look back, I think, and find more patterns from the post-war industrial boom and how our society managed to provision infrastructure then. And that's how we're going to move forward into this next chapter.
We always talk about like this tipping point that people point to of like how much renewable energy can we deploy before the grid starts to get messed up, or how many electric vehicles can be on the road. I feel like the tipping point is actually a lot sooner than a lot of us think, in that like even minor tweaks to this, as you mentioned, century-old system can have a major impact early on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would frame it a little differently, which is that all of the trends we've been talking about at sort of call it the last few years of chapter 1 of the energy transition, were all about these long-term trends that were limited or rate limited by consumer preference, consumer awareness, interest rates, manufacturing capability, right? Supply chains. And so really we were talking about soft signal political economy trends that would unfurl at varying rates. That's why we've been looking at graphs that have high, medium, low cases for so long, is that all of those trends were uncertain and they were going to play out over decades. What's changed just in the last 18 months, and I really believe will change everything about how the energy transition will go down, is that manufacturing is coming back now. And when you look at a factory that's heavily automated, that has robotics and a huge electric load, there are factories that are coming back that need 500 megawatts of draw, a gigawatt of draw, 1.5, 2 gigawatts, right? Look at direct reduction steel plants. So there are utilities that might have a 6 gigawatt grid that have 2 applications from a 2 gigawatt manufacturing customer. And that's just manufacturing.
Yeah, it takes 3 years to interconnect a data center, like at minimum.
Right. Yeah. And the real ball game is data centers. Data centers used to be 10, 30, 50, 100 megawatts, right? The biggest data centers were 300 megawatts. And now you're regularly seeing training focused data centers with the newest generation of chips and GPUs that are saying, look, we would love 750 megawatts at the minimum, but really we could use 1.5 gigawatts. And hey, if you could do 2 gigawatts, we'll build like 10.
We'll take it.
I have seen utilities that have, in their current customer queues, requests from data centers alone for double the power that they produce in an entire state. So those trends are not long-term soft trends. Those trends are not about interest rates. Those trends are not about customer adoption. That is about a gosh darn return to American manufacturing in a unprecedented demand level. And it's also about data centers really driving generative AI, which is a critical input to economic productivity, per capita GDP, and how we're going to navigate information and our economy.
Well, Pier LaFarge, thanks so much for joining me today. I think what you guys are doing at Sparkfund is really interesting and really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks again to Pierre LaFarge for joining the podcast. Factor This is a production of Renewable Energy World and Clarion Energy. Join us every Monday as we take on the clean energy industry's biggest stories with industry leaders who actually move the needle. And please leave us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Factor This from Renewable Energy World.